I have three things to talk about. Firstly, I want to talk about why obesity, smoking, and other kinds of lifestyle choices are things that are actually very difficult to change, though we acknowledge that they are changeable. Why we want to prove that they're very difficult to change and therefore actually belong in the public sphere, they actually belong in companies despite those companies being private. The second thing I want to talk about are situations in which their lifestyle choices, such as obesity, for some corporations, completely do not affect profit, right? Which is why they have to engage with that role as well. Because we think the mistake from their side thus far has been just completely focusing on the special corporations, for example, like Nike or sports corporation that have to suddenly put fat person on the poster board, which therefore damages profit. They have to engage in our side of the house, where also some people do not affect profit. In those circumstances, we need to prioritize their legitimate identities, right? There's no reason to Finally, but we believe that even if we're talking about their world, we want to prove why we can take the moral high ground. Because even though they said, oh, the harm that will happen as a result of the company losing profit is that everybody that they have to face foreclosure and that people will get laid off. We think that this debate is not about the quantity of harm, but rather the quality of harm. Because at the end of the day, the corporation that harm is reversible, right? And mitigatable. While under our side of the house, the people who are seriously completely depending on the company, like Shushaku looking for a job, they're going to be in a complete disaster situation, which is why we want to prioritize those people over the company, right? I think this is one of the clashes we want to engage with. So beginning with this debate, I want to first talk about two cases that they brought up. The first case that they brought up was that was about the harm to the company, right? We think that we question the very premise that the companies will be harmed in the very first place, right? They gave us examples of how Zhao, when they have drunk pilots, they might be deprived of their license, or they might not be able to fly planes to England anymore, which will decrease all the profit within the company. We think that that's not necessarily something we have to defend on our side of the house, right? Because what we are defending is that when we are hiring that individual, right, that company can actually use lifestyle choices, right? But that does not mean that in every single activity within the company, we have to allow those lifestyle choices to exist. For example, when there's somebody who is serious drinking problem, we won't assign that person to fly gigantic passenger plane across the world, right? Because that is serious injury. We think it's principally consistent as long as we're giving them a job and as long as we're allowing them to exist in the company by doing other kinds of very valuable work. For example, delivering the supplies. For example, when you're drunk and you crash the supplies, you're not actually getting any of the harm that they're talking about. So all the harm they're talking about, we can absorb into what we have to actually defend, right? The second thing they talked about was foreclosure, right? I think that this harm is also very mitigatable, right? Because firstly, we think that a lot of the average worker in society today, when you actually have to find a job, because the job sphere is so competitive that the average worker has lots of skill, right? They're able to go to university and they're able to have skills that transfer across corporations. So even if that company loses profit, we think that that individual can go to another company, or that company can transfer its human resources and create another company in another area, right? We think that there's no reason why that harm is something that's permanent, right? They also talked about individuals. They also talked about how individuals on their side of the house, when they get fired, they were able to see suggestion, the reason you got fired was because you had negative lifestyle choice, right? We think it's worse under their side of the house, right? Because when you fire those people, you have to analyze the circumstances of these people. These people are people who are probably fresh out of college and they are really, really desperate for a job, right? In Japan, we literally have people who are committing suicide because they have to send so many applications and they're getting constantly rejected, right? All of that gets worse under their side of the house when you give extra criteria for many people to deal with, right? What happens under their side of the house is that people become extremely stressed and they probably drink more. They probably resort to these kind of coping mechanisms such as eating a lot of potato chips or doing things that are not so productive. So they don't benefit the individuals, and also the harm to the company is also mitigatable. I'll take you after my next point, sorry. We want to talk about first why obesity and smoking are legitimate public identities. We have three reasons here. Firstly, we say that they're largely unchangeable, right? And the reason, they just gave us an assertion, right? That these things are actually changeable. But we say that they're not changeable. Why? We think, first of all, it's very hard to opt out of situations in which you have drinking issue or when you're too obese. The reason being that the reason you go into these lifestyle choices is because you're dealing with extreme stress. That stress comes from the structural capitalism of society, where we have to have such strong competition between companies that it's very hard for an individual to get a job in the very first place, which means that that individual is using this drinking problem as a way of coping, as a way of basically surviving in status quo to stay sane, right? Which we think that it's very hard for them to change, and those people will be thrown out under their side of the house. But secondly, we think that the harm to the company is just not so serious in the very first place, right? Because first of all, we don't see what kind of tangible harm, like, in the case, we're not talking about cases where they're crashing plane. But for example, when you're an obese person sitting in the office, right, we don't see the very tangible harm that brings to the company, right? Because that has nothing to do with your ability to create like Microsoft document, has nothing to do with your mental ability, right? So we think that this is simply discrimination, right? In status quo, we don't allow company to discriminate against people's like sexual orientation, right? Even though it might be uncomfortable, this is something that gives them meaning, and this is something that is also very hard to change, and it doesn't have tangible consequence to the company. It's just the individual with different identity existing in your workplace. Okay, I take it.
You said that like employees have mobility, so even if they are fired, they can move to another company. Now you say that these employees will not be able to get into the company. Which analysis is true?
Okay, there are different employees, right? We're talking about employees who are actually able to enter the company, but then they get fired. We think that people who are already in the company who get fired, they will be able, they might not be able to go to a different company because you are actively rejecting them, right? So we think that those are different people that we're talking about. So let's talk about the situation where even though the company will lose profit, we still have to prioritize the individual, right? Because recognize that the trade-off here is basically the vicious cycle which makes the extent of harm more serious for the individual over the company. Because recognize that the competition between companies like Nike or big conglomerates like Google, they already have such strong competition within each other that they're trying to look for a competitive edge, which means that which means that if we allow this policy to exist, that means all of the major corporations that are giving people like daily sustenance that they can actually rely on in 21st century are going to be discriminating against these people. That means that it's literally impossible for these people to be able to find a job, which is important for their daily sustenance, right? We think that that harm is completely unmitigatable because it's a structural imbalance of power that's perpetuated by the capitalism, and if we allow that policy to exist, these people will no longer be able to live life. They'll no longer be happy, be able to send their children to college. That harm is greater than the harm that they told us, which is just that the company will be able to lose profit, right? As I explained, all of those harms are mitigatable, and even if like this debate is not about the quantity of people that you're losing, but it's about the extent of harm for those individuals. We think that there's a qualitative difference, which is why we win this debate. Number one, we think that there's certain cases where your identity, public lifestyle does not affect the profit. They think they have to engage with that, which is why we can win. Second of all, even if it affects the profit, we think that we take moral high ground because those individuals' harm is greater. And finally, we think that on principle level is justified because it doesn't harm other people. It gives those individuals meaning and is actually very largely unchangeable and should not be burdened for employees. That's why we're proud to apply.